Hello and welcome to the third video on drawing for self-defense with a sword. And if you haven't seen the first two videos that we did using the rapier and the saber, the idea of this is to consider the comparatively modern principle used in law enforcement of the minimum safe distance at which you can draw and fire 2 shots at centre body mass before a knife attacker can reach you. And we're now applying that principle in this case, the longsword. And the reason we're doing this is because what we do in HEMA, which is historical European martial arts, is more than just sport. We're not doing this just for tournaments, just for show. We're actually doing it to try and understand the weapons historically, practice with them as historically as we can, and understand the context of who carried them, how they were used in self-defense scenarios, or military contexts as well. So we're going on to the longsword. Now longsword has meant different things through different time periods and different cultures, but largely today we use the term from German, which is Langschwert, which is literally longsword. In England, sometimes longsword has meant something a little bit different, sometimes a long-bladed one-handed sword, but because there are so many surviving manuals and treaties on the German style from Lechtenau, longsword has become the generic term used throughout most communities in the world for the sword that's used primarily in 2 hands. And we're talking about a sword that can actually be carried on the side for self-defense, and not some of the much larger 2-handed swords such as the Montante, the Zweihander, and similar. So, the principle of the 21-foot rule is getting off 2 shots. So what do we want to look at as something equivalent for the longsword in this case? Well, when somebody rushes at you with a knife, obviously you're going to have to either strike them down or make them stop in their tracks in a way that you can actually recover into a safe guard. Because if you've managed to draw your sword into a safe position that it's a normal fight, then the sword against the dagger will have a huge advantage. So either way is absolutely fine. Now obviously there can be a huge number of variables when looking at the 21-foot rule. It's not a perfect rule by any means. You've got to consider what is the terrain like, how fast is your opponent, what's your training like, what are your response times like, when do you actually perceive the threat, all these kinds of things. But for this example, the principle is this. The knife attacker has the knife hidden or sheathed. They withdraw or reveal the weapon, so you actually perceive the threat at that set distance, and can you respond within that set distance with the weapon that you've got, or weapons that you've got. For this exercise, we're going to be using an Albion Maya. The Albion Maya, although it looks like a Fetischwert, most people will consider it to be more like a blunt sword. It looks in profile more like a sort of blunt sword. It handles and the weight and sort of general characteristics more like a lot of sharp swords than a lot of sort of feathers are today that we use in our sparring. I would have liked to have used an Albion Lechtenau for this. Sadly, at the moment we've only got scabbards that could fit something like the Maya. Saying that, as I said with this sword, it is a really good representation of a lot of period longswords, so I think it works really, really well for it. The suspension system is a 2-point suspension system, which is not unlike the way a rapier is carried. The setup for this situation is where the knife attacker has a knife or dagger sheathed or hidden, and the time at which they draw that blade, that is when they become a threat. Now obviously in real life scenarios, somebody could draw a knife at any time, they could walk straight up and draw it at a short distance. But for the sake of this exercise, we're considering the distance at which you perceive that threat, so the time at which the dagger is drawn or you realise that somebody is going to be a threat to you. So we're going to start looking at 21 feet because that is the rule for modern handgun stuff. And you'll notice that just on this one particular exercise, if you for any reason hesitate, you strike lightly, or you try and keep your opponent at a distance or threaten with a point, there is a real threat that they will just close in on you, use their offhand and stab you. And in this case, the knife attacker might have taken a light cut to the arm, but would have delivered a fatal blow with the dagger. So when you're doing this kind of exercise, you have to be going for that incapacitating or killing blow, or something that's going to allow you to control the dagger or get into a safe scenario to be in guard at wide measure. Now what we found at 21 feet is that as soon as people had just a very modest amount of practice with the longsword, is they were able to draw the sword and deal a good strike every single time, no problem. So we now move on to 18 feet. Well, a bit like the other videos, if you look at the saber video for example, we found that the difference between 18 and 21 feet is really not much at all. So yet again, at 18 feet you should be able to draw the longsword and deliver a good attack. So we move down to 15 feet because we want to look at not just what is safe to actually draw from, but how it's going to work at closer distances, what your options are, and how that sort of situation is going to pan out. At 15 feet we found that the chances of the dagger reaching the swordsman, even if he was going to be hit, actually increased quite a bit. So 15 feet is that distance at which you've really got to be worried that you're not going to get the sword drawn in time. And of course you have to consider your options of, is it best to draw the sword and get bound up and possibly stabbed, or could you use other options, as we're going to consider a bit later in the video. But for now we're looking at how it'll pan out drawing the sword at different distances. One example you can see where it doesn't go so well at 15 feet is where the swordsman draws his sword and strikes, but he strikes around to the offhand of the dagger wielder. Now there is a good chance that that would just not have stopped the dagger fighter in his tracks. He would have taken some severe injury there, but not enough to have stopped him getting to you. And once again, we're not worried about will he die sort of now or later, it's can you actually survive or actually get out of that fight unscathed, ideally. And if you see here, the sword strikes the dagger fighter on the arm and he carries on through and delivers a fatal thrust. Having said that, there were plenty of occasions with a bit more practice where it was easily achievable to draw from 15 feet and cut well, but you have to be reasonably well trained, quite competent, and with fast reaction times. Because again, in this sort of setup, you know that there's an attacker coming at you, whereas in many self-defense scenarios, you're not going to know that a threat even exists until it presents itself. So that will of course affect your response times as well. So we move down to 12 feet. What we found at 12 feet is you had to be exceptionally skilled to pull this off, and very fast, and you really had to be stepping offline as well. So it is possible at 12, quite often actually. So the level I think you could train to make it doable almost every single time, unless you had a very fast and very aggressive attacker. You'll notice here at 12 feet where the swordsman stayed relatively stationary, and although he delivers a cut, it wasn't really significant to actually stop the dagger fighter. So again, this sort of 12-foot distance, you have to move, you have to go sideways, you have to be fast, you have to be good on the draw. So yeah, you've really got to use everything to your advantage to pull it off at 12 feet. You'll see another one here at 12 feet that did work, where there was a sidestep and a single-handed cut, and then a really nice recovery. So this worked really well as well. So this is a really good example of how you can pull it off at 12 feet. So then we move down to 9, and obviously we're getting to a really, really dangerous distance now. However, you see this example here where it's a single-hand draw and cut into the actual dagger, which could of course potentially take out the attacker's hands depending on what kind of guard they've got on their dagger. If it's a more open sort of knife, then this would actually hopefully incapacitate the hand. But if they've got any kind of cross guard like these daggers have, it's just going to stop the dagger dead, which is still useful, and then you can get out of the way and cut around. And another example at 9 feet, but then also use the offhand to control the dagger fighter's hand whilst using the sword to cut him. So this worked really well because of course in any kind of knife or dagger fight, if you can control that knife, that is really beneficial. So moving down to 6 feet, as you can imagine, it becomes practically impossible. At 6 feet, a dagger fighter can reach you with realistically just one passing step. And if you see here, Gareth as the attacker, he does actually take a small step off his front foot before making the pass, but realistically it's sort of one passing step and you're in. And you're not going to draw the sword and be able to do anything significant in that time. So at 6 feet, you just don't really even bother. It's way, way too risky to consider using the sword, drawing the sword in that scenario. So what you do at these distances, which are going to be very, very short, such as 6 feet and possibly 9 feet as well, when you are not confident that the sword is going to be able to be drawn in time, or that you're going to be able to draw it and deliver a significant cut, well, most swordsmen that were carrying these kind of swords, whether it be a longsword or a rapier, they would have been carrying a knife or a dagger as a sidearm, or also a utility sort of blade. And it was commonly carried on the right side so that you could draw into a pick grip or underhand grip very easily, or cross draw if you're trying to use weapons in both hands. So you can, instead of trying to worry about drawing the sword, is you can just use your standard sort of dagger defense of using your offhand for defensive work, draw the dagger and use that instead, and that can work really, really well. Another possibility, which is even quicker still, is that you could just rely on your basic dagger defense skills, assuming you were unarmed, which could work perfectly well in this situation, whether you've got a sword on your side or not. So you can just use your offhand to protect yourself and strike with the right hand, which should create enough of an opening to either grab the opponent's dagger, strike him again, or get away and draw your sword. We then look at how this would go with against a sword. So your threat is now against a swordsman. He's got a sword drawn, you perceive the threat, and he runs at you. Now, for this exercise, we use the spares padded sabres, for the simple reason that when we were doing this, the longswordman is wearing nothing but just plain leather gloves. And if he took a hit from a substantial sword, you're talking about broken fingers. And we did not want big sort of bulky gloves that you might use for sparring interfering with the draw technique. So there was still a possibility of getting hit on the hands, but it wasn't going to do severe damage. Now what we found is that, as before, the distances don't change that drastically, is that the safe draw distance is still about 18 to 21, and that is where it really works well. At 15 it gets quite hairy. The difference is that at the shorter distances where you might have got away with drawing the sword before, so when you're down to 12 and below, is against a sword that really didn't work because they've just got so much more range, they've got nice big cutting arcs, it just becomes so much more difficult. So yeah, the 18 to 21 foot worked fine, 15 was quite dangerous, and below that you're really in trouble. So in conclusion, what do we find using the longsword for self-defense? What we found is much the same as the saber and the rapier, is that 18 to 21 foot is the distance at which, just after a small amount of training, you should be able to safely draw and strike a good hit that would stop your opponent in that time. And we found that at 15 feet things get a little bit hairy, and below that you really have to use absolutely everything to your advantage of stepping offline, covering distance quickly, possibly striking with a single hand cut, and controlling the dagger hand. And once you get below about 9 feet, you have to be just going to the dagger or your open hand techniques to defend yourself. So that's what we found with the longsword in sort of draws in self-defense scenarios. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe if you haven't already.